Greetings and good Monday morning to you. It is, let me double check, the 28th of March, 2022, third decade, 21st century. Um, going to be a bit of a double header for you today. This first video, Miss Sheila and I did another Zoom call. Miss Sheila chose the topic and she chose COVID. And I think we had an interesting conversation. I tried to keep it to about an hour. So, I apologize if we didn't cover every aspect or if we didn't cover every viewpoint or every potential angle. Um, Again, part of the goal was to just have a civilized conversation, whether we agree or disagree. And from the way I remember it, there was no real left or right or yes versus no or anything of that because we were just two people having a conversation, expressing our opinions, and hopefully that's what you get out of it as well. Um, if you saw any disagreement, I'd be very curious to hear what you saw or what you picked up on that I didn't pick up on. So please, leave a comment, and if you want to get involved in the conversation, leave a comment. Let me, and more importantly, let me know if you want me to respond or not. So, thank you for being here. Thank you for taking a listen or a watch or whatever you do. You're awesome. All right, we're live. Hit me up. What do you got?
All right, so this was my idea of something to talk about just because I was thinking about why you started your channel, and it has to do with like sort of what I'm going through now personally. And I don't want to argue about it from a political perspective or anything like that, but I thought it might be interesting just to talk about our different perspectives of going through COVID, since now we are in technically year 3 of COVID. And people are debating on whether it's just going to become endemic like the flu or not, and stuff like that, and variants of concern and blah, 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 blah. But like this is the first time in our lifetimes of going through a global pandemic. And and I think that people have very different perspectives on it, very different experiences. And I just thought it might be interesting to talk about and maybe give people different perspectives on what are different people's experiences of this pandemic, not as a necessarily a point of contention or argument, but just different perspectives.
Oh, I'm down. Yeah. So trying to leave politics out of it. Yeah, I'm
Well, I
perfectly.
mean, I mean, if there are little minuscule things about where like it personally affected me in this way, like kind of stuff, like I'm not saying like you can't mention something that's political, but just like not with the goal of, hey, let's argue different political standpoint. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I gotta tell you, I get the feeling we might have more common ground than we don't. Only because, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're somebody who has to thoroughly look at the vaccine due to pre-existing conditions, right? Like you have to.
That was one aspect, yes,
Okay, yeah.
that I had to go through. And then um I'm also still kind of a hostage to it due to being immunocompromised. I'm still kind of a hostage to these rampant spikes that keep happening. And honestly, even if there aren't spikes, I'm still a hostage to it because any asshole could give me COVID at any moment. But even if, like, even if I just get sick, like it's something that profoundly affects me. And, it isn't just like for me, a lot of people make the assumption of like, you don't look sick, et cetera, et cetera. And because I don't look incredibly sick, people just make assumptions like out of hand automatically. And that can lead to, difficulties day to day in terms of trying to, but there's also this aspect of I'm an extrovert, which is actually a rare personality. Like I'm an extreme extrovert, which is a rare personality type. And that's just another aspect, you know, that sort of interweaves with this of I'm going on my 3rd year of chronic isolation due to this.
I'll try to give you some thoughts. They may not be the most organized, but first and foremost, I don't
Well, I
think.
thought maybe we could start off with like, what was 2020 like for you, like when it first came up?
Well, give me a second. I'll get there.
Oh, okay. Okay. Give some thoughts.
Quit stepping on me, for crying out
All right.
loud.
All right. I won't.
All right. So going back to 2020, I'll try to run through this as quickly as I can, because if you're okay with it, I'd like to keep it to about an hour. You good?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
So my last official day at the office was March 17th, 2020. I showed up with a handful of other people because we were scheduled to do our job. I teach a class once a week. Under normal circumstances, I'll teach a class once a week. And then the rest of the week, we would hold office hours to answer any questions, etc. So I showed up that Tuesday, March 17th, and the brief got canceled. And I think we were there for maybe half a day. And then we went home. And then we worked from home the rest of the week. And then we basically were given permission to enter 1 hour a day for the following week. And if we wanted the rest of the time, if we had vacation time built up, we could use vacation time to get the full 40 hours. And then after that, we were furloughed for about 3 weeks. The company we worked for, I'll spare you a lot of the details, but the company we worked for got a small loan for a payroll protection plan. And for about 9 weeks, we got paid to basically do nothing under the pretense that eventually we would all go back to work. That never happened. The client that we service, I'm not using terms just yet because I don't know if this will ever come back to bite me, so I'm trying to keep it neutral. I'm a subcontractor who works for a general contractor who works for a federal client. The federal client had some disagreements with the general contractor, and they chose COVID as an opportunity to renegotiate, in which case, basically we lost our jobs.
Right.
So yes, I was affected by that.
Right.
I did go to a friend of mine was able to provide me with some day laboring, basically under the table. Nothing I could claim on taxes. But it was just enough to basically kind of get me by with whatever I had in savings, etc. That lasted for maybe 6 weeks. And then basically he couldn't afford me, so he let me go. Having said all that, my opinion, I feel as though we overreacted for the entire country. I feel as though we overreacted. I feel as though we overreacted based on limited data and based on people I've talked to that are pretty smart. If you use the scientific method, based on the circumstances, there wasn't enough time to compile data to make the decisions we were making. And then, I mean, I'm streamlining this. I could go in way more detail, but I'm trying to streamline this to open it back up to you. In conjunction with that, I feel as though there were people who had legitimate concerns and had to legitimately worry, not just about COVID, but like someone like yourself, you have to worry regardless. So I feel as though there was a tremendous overreaction. I feel as though it provided an opportunity for people to politicize it to their advantage. And I don't think we responded accordingly. I think we overreacted, which I've said numerous times. And then as you maneuver into the shot, okay, the same people who scream.
Well, can we stop there? Maybe pause there, and I'll talk about the kind of 20, because the shot didn't really come into play till 2021 for most people, you know? And so like, maybe I could just like talk about the early experiences with it, and then we can like go back and forth about the shot and like what our experiences are with that. So like, yeah, so when it first came, like I actually had the opposite perception especially because, so at the time I was dating a first responder when it first came out. And dating is a light thing. We had been together for 4.5 years. And we sort of like, we saw this thing coming and saw the data on like what were the risk factors at each age group and all that kind of stuff. And so in a lot of ways, we underreacted, and a lot of people underreacted, depending on what, you know, what your perception is and what, you know, like we waited until it was kind of too late to curb things in a lot of places. In some places, right, like this is very regional, and like, are you living in a urban area or a rural area? If you're living in a more rural area, it's never going to spike to overwhelm. But if you're living in like New York City, Seattle, you know, like places like that, the hospitals just cannot take these preventable death surges where the hospitals get overwhelmed, and then you need to put in refrigerator carts for bodies and stuff like that. And where I live is like kind of a middle ground kind of place where it's like we can definitely get overwhelmed, and especially since where I live is where the main tier 1 public hospital is for everyone in the whole state. We get overwhelmed very easily because the size versus where people come when they're in crisis is rough. And I actually was one of the very first people to get COVID in my state. You know, like I was on the very front edges of that. And I was already having trouble breathing at that point because they suspected that I had possibly even been one of those early cases of COVID, since my partner was a first responder, like that this was possibly my second time getting it. Yeah. And so they didn't even have testing available for people at the time that I got it. And the only reason they even diagnosed it the second time I got really sick and it really hit my lungs was because I had never had problems with my lungs my whole life until these 2 illnesses back to back in a matter of like 5 months. And the only reason they confirmed it as COVID the second time, because I wasn't eligible for testing yet when I would have been ill in March of 2020, like right at the shutdown, was that I ended up getting blood clots around my lungs 2 months later. And I ended up getting very classic post-COVID signs. But I was sick, like with acute COVID for 2 months. I had to get IVs like constantly, just to not be hospitalized. And that's the only reason I wasn't hospitalized, is because I had a medical field partner giving me IVs at home to prevent me from dehydrating. And I talked with a specialist about how to breathe. I had like this spirometer that I was using all the time. I was taking like every lung thing that I could possibly take. Like it was a village of care to keep me out of the hospital. And then one day I just like flopped and lost consciousness. I ended up in the hospital, and that's when they found the blood clots around my lungs. And I went through hell, like the next several months of them trying to differentially diagnose whether I actually had post-COVID syndrome, because they were just discovering it at that point. This was June of 2020 versus, oh, are you developing a clotting disorder from your bone marrow, blah, 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 blah. And so they put me on, you know, anticoagulants and all these, you know, blood thinners and stuff like that. I started bleeding everywhere. Like my apartment looked like The Shining. And I'm like my doctor went on vacation right when this happened. And I'm trying to talk to her. And there's with chronically ill patients, there's always this catch-22 of being a compliant patient and doing what doctors are telling you versus like you inherently know what they're doing is wrong and that it's hurting you more than it's helping you, and not getting labeled as a patient who is just not following their treatment plans and doing things against your best interests, so that you don't get turfed to psych and end up like with these serious issues. And so it just became this nightmare, right? Of this acute nightmare. And all I could think about was this. My partner and I broke up because he had serious stress issues, and he acted out for the first time in our relationship with an incident where he physically injured me. And it was shocking. Like, nobody expected, everyone was like, this guy would never do anything like this. So I was dealing with the injuries from that on top of post-COVID syndrome. And honestly, I was sick for almost a year from that first sort of wave of things. And I was very lucky because I was one of the few patients who had doctors who recognized this is post-COVID syndrome, and we're going to treat the symptoms very seriously. And I was one of the few people who improved during that time. So I actually, during this time that was an absolute hell, I actually felt very fortunate at the same time, and a ton of gratitude, because my doctors were actually helping me to get better. I wasn't spending all my time fighting to try and be believed that there was something seriously wrong that was unusual from the normal things that were wrong with me, and that it was much worse, and that I just needed help. And I did. I got substantially better during that period. And then 2021 rolled around, the vaccine started rolling out. And that brings us to vaccinations.
Well, quite a few things I could comment on. One thing my therapist brought to my attention, which was kind of an obvious thing, but sometimes when you hear it verbalized a certain way, it's like this epiphany moment, like, oh my God. So when people are affected by something, or when people are impacted by something, it's typically 100% their reality or 100% their world. Mm-hmm. And because her and I have talked about COVID, and I was like, I'm just not experiencing these things. So it's not 100% my reality. It's not 100% my world. And therefore I'm not impacted. And that's why my thoughts and my opinions. But everybody was impacted by COVID, which is why I think it's a decent topic to talk about. Not that you have to say your business per se, but as an individual, were you somebody who was susceptible for underlying conditions where, like, you were the most ideal person to get COVID for all the negative things versus like somebody else who gets it and it's like, I got a runny nose, that's it. The same exact strain, but two different reactions, if that makes sense to you.
Theoretically, there were a lot of, like, well, not a lot. There was one expert and he's one that I kind of trust because I find his research to be more robust and more thoughtful about the multifaceted issues and the underlying root cause of this one condition that I have, which is called mast cell activation syndrome. So just like very briefly, mast cells are the things that produce histamine. And most people know what histamine is, right? That's the crap that releases for inflammation and allergies and stuff like that. But if you have this syndrome, your body is just really prone to dumping histamine, for one. And that's the one aspect of it. So you tend to be much more inflammatory and much more reactive to things. But the other interesting aspect of it is, in some people, like something that, if you follow the news very closely, cytokines is another thing that are prone to not be great in this condition. And cytokines are the things that we found out were things that were attacking lungs in a lot of people and not allowing oxygen to get through in those cases of people who are getting put on oxygen and not being able to breathe because it was really screwing up their alveoli and like just not letting oxygen get into the bloodstream. So to not get too into the weeds on the medical stuff, that's a condition I have. So in theory, yes, but it's a very underdiagnosed condition. Like, they believe up to maybe 20% of the population may have it to some degree or another. And it affects some people far more. Like, I'm a person who's had anaphylactic shock due to it, so I'm on the more severe end. Some people, it's like they just tend to get like rashes, or their GI system is a little more flared, or stuff like that. So it kind of depends, right? Like, how far are you on the spectrum? Now, I traditionally have not had serious asthma and lung problems, but I have had times where I've gotten sick and I've had illness-induced asthma. So, I'm like on that fence of, well, yeah, if it hits my lungs, that could be a really bad thing. Now, I got very lucky in that aside from the blood clots later, the COVID infection itself never went down into my lungs, as far as they know. I never got pneumonia anyway, and it never caused necrosis in my lungs. So I'm fortunate to have been on the luckier end of that, but still, it profoundly affected my lungs. My oxygen dropped from 100% to 93% as a active, like walking around. I was walking around, like, if you think about a morbidly obese person walking around, like when they walk 10 steps and they're huffing and puffing and they've got to stop and rest, that's what I was breathing like during the acute phases of this. And even people, when they would listen to me talk, they kept asking me what was wrong with my voice. And during that time, I honestly didn't know what they were talking about until one day I realized that it was my breathing, right, and the stammering that was happening in my breathing due to that they were picking up on, but over the phone, it wasn't clear that I was panting so much, trying to catch my breath.
So I apologize in advance. It's going to seem like I bounce around quite a bit, but trust me when I say
it doesn't have to be an outline. This is just a conversation.
Well, I'm coming to a point. So when I bring up things like confirmation bias, or I bring up outrage culture, I'm referencing various experiences up to and including you and I were not subject to our parents being overwhelmed with talk television, where you take a micro issue, put it on TV, make it feel like it's macro, and then you have the helicopter parents of the 90s. You and I didn't suffer that. However, no. we look at the generation that's maybe 10 years or more younger than us, who grew up with the helicopter parents. And
my brother is 10 years younger, but my parents, although different with him than me, were not that to him.
Well, my point being is, for some people that they were exposed to, you take a micro issue and you make it macro. And that kind of goes back to the outrage thing I was trying to talk about, where, we're involving ourselves in micro issues, pretending that they're macro when they're really micro, and you're not really affected by it. So a very wide open statement to kind of come to this. My personal thoughts on COVID. There are those people it was going to affect. I'm not going to add more adjectives to it. There are some people it was going to affect, and for them, that was going to be 100% their reality, like yourself, and they would have some opinions on the subject. Then there's others who, would be on the far end of the spectrum, and then there's those in the middle. So I feel as though on the macro level, there was a tremendous overreaction. However, the people in your circumstances may feel as though there was a tremendous underreaction. And I think what I found hubris was, I'm not going to name names, but people getting on television, oh, you got to do this, you got to do that, expert, trust the science. And it's like, well, in this particular case, science needs a little bit of time to figure things out. And how many times have you gotten it wrong? My personal feelings on this subject, but then again, when you look at how we were affected, we weren't adversely affected with health. We were adversely affected economically. Mm-hmm. So it's very difficult to see your point of view when we were not physically affected from a health perspective. We were detrimentally affected economically. So, and it wasn't even that bad, but for 2020, it was pretty crummy. I mean, we didn't go back to work until a day or two before Christmas of 2021. And I was very fortunate that, 2020, that for the entire year of 2021, I was able to work. I was able to generate an income. I was terribly fortunate with that. But when I look at how everything was impacted, and mask, no mask, this rule or that rule, I feel as though there was a tremendous overreaction. But I'm well aware that equally and opposite, somebody who was horrifically affected by it, not financially, but horrifically affected physically in the health spectrum, that's 100% your world. And you can very well have a completely different opinion because of your individual experiences. And that's why I like how you brought it up, because yeah, I think it is a bit of a touchy subject, because some people don't want to wrap their minds around the fact that, well, it didn't adversely affect you, so how could you empathize? How could you even try to pretend to care?
Right.
But the difficulty there is the people that we elect, to basically take care of our freedoms. I don't personally feel as though they responded correctly. And then I also
Well,
think that they took advantage of it to make it a political situation. And then after that, I just think it's a dirty toilet that nobody wants to look at.
and here's the interesting thing is I I agree on several points that you're making, but possibly for different reasons. Like I just have a different perspective on why I agree, and and I acknowledge the economic impacts, and there's certain services that just needed to sort of maintain and continue. And also, we just live in a society that is so strongly inherently capitalist. So what do you say to somebody where it's like, well, for the good of society, like for the good of society now, Americans need to protect one another. We need to protect our most vulnerable. But we're going to ignore that you're super vulnerable economically in our strongly capitalist society that has no safety nets, you know? And that just is, it's so mind-bogglingly broken to protect people from a pandemic, so like telling people, hey, be considerate about this really sick person, even though you're not going to get sick, probably. Like it's really low likelihood you're going to get sick, but now you can't work and you can't make a living and you can't feed your family. Like, yeah, that's a broken fucking way to try and deal with it, and it's complicated. But the thing is that our system would need such a massive overhaul to deal with it, and we just were not prepared, especially like a lot of emergency use funds and things that we had stockpiled up had been deleted but right before that, and so we just did not have the capacity to deal with this problem. And it was a problem. And we used to have pandemic response, like sort of templates in place. And we really still have not fixed them. It's like very hard to say, like, oh, this person's concerns are more important than this person's concerns when they're all screwed. Like every person's screwed.
I'm with you 100%. It's preposterous, because people who are adversely affected economically, how can you convince them to care for those who are affected physically? I mean, it seems simple enough when you verbalize it. When you say the words out loud, it seems simple enough. But then at the end of the day, like, hey, you're about to lose your electricity. Hey, you probably can't even afford top robin. Hey, we're probably going to repossess your house. I mean, like when we were on the verge of negotiating.
And that's the thing, is that you put somebody into homelessness, malnutrition, like all of these kinds of things, suddenly their health is at risk, because a huge risk is being homeless, being malnourished, like all of those things. Suddenly their health is at risk. And then suddenly they are also unhealthy and don't have even the basics of, survival going on. So every person's going to be tuned in to like, yeah, which aspects of survival are harming me the most.
And then, because I feel like we could probably treadmill this one for a while, and it's a worthwhile topic, but you talk about the vaccine, right? Let me make this comment before I give you my opinion. The one thing I found hilarious is the same group of people who are on the side of the aisle of my body, my choice did not want to apply the exact same logic when it came to the vaccine. There, I said it, I'm done, I'm moving on.
Okay.
I thought the mandate was preposterous. I had to get the shot to keep my job. And then at the end of the day, I probably didn't have to, because I have a coworker who out and out refused it, claimed a religious exemption, although I don't know how true that is, did not get fired. But in North Carolina, it's a right to work state. Whether our employer, the subcontractor who was actually threatening us, is aware of that, in a right to work state, you can quit without reason, you can quit without notice, and you can also be fired without reason, fired without notice. He has not been let go. I got it because of two people. My boss, because we're both retired, he's like, dude, how many shots did you get in the service without question? Oh yeah, I got them all. Because of your service, do you
right, like anthrax and stuff like that, that's super risky.
He's like,
and they know it, and they're just like, you're getting it, whatever.
You think the government doesn't have your DNA and your geotag and all of that craziness on file from the 5 combat deployments you did? And I was like, oh no, absolutely. I'm screwed. You know, I'm on the grid no matter what, because, you know, if the government was going to do it, they did it a long time ago. And he's like, so what are you afraid of? And I was like, I think it's just a matter of who's telling me to get it. And he's like, okay, well, you know who actually came up with the shot? And I was like, yeah, I know who got the shot approved. It's just now somebody else is in charge saying get it or else. And I was like, that's my biggest issue. And then I talked to my therapist, and I told her everything my boss had said. And she's like, yeah, those are all good points. And I was like, what about you? And she goes, well, before I got into this line of work, I was pre-med. So I'm still friends with a lot of people, one of which is is a virologist. Like, this is her line of work. And I was like, okay, she get the Pfizer shot. I was like, all right, roger that. She goes, don't worry about all the political economic nonsense and Pfizer this and just trust me, Pfizer's got the most research and data and whatnot. So if you want to feel safe, get the Pfizer shot. So I ended up getting the 2 Pfizer shots. I haven't gotten the booster. And the only reason I did it was so that I wouldn't lose my job. I had to convince myself why I had to get it so that I wouldn't lose my job. And then at the end of the day, it looks like the one guy who didn't get it might end up getting away with it. And, you know, that's neither here nor there. What I really despise, and this is where I'm going to play into you, what I really despise is there's people like you, people who have underlying conditions who have to really thoroughly consider getting the shot. And now you have these same people on television talking about you as though you're some sort of demon, you're some sort of antichrist, you're some sort of anti-social anarchist looking to bring down our society and the economy. And it's like, that's tremendously ignorant, because there's absolutely no room for nuance. You have a legitimate medical reason to thoroughly consider whether you should or even could get the vaccine. And then you start looking at the healthcare industry is overwhelmed. Yeah, because you fired over so many percent of the nurses in major metropolitan areas where they're a little more in one direction than another, and you let all these nurses and, you know, medical practitioners go because my body, my choice. And I'm just like, it's the same number of patients. You just have a lot less workers because you actively let them go. And is there more detail? Is there more nuance? I'm sure.
Yes. There's a lot more nuance.
That's why I live where I live, because that's not necessarily a big issue down here as it is in like where I grew up.
Right. So like from my perspective, 2021, another rough year. It was like 2020 sucked. I'm so glad it's fucking over. 2021 comes. Oh my God. This year is another freaking kick in the teeth.
2 weeks. 2 weeks. Is it more like 2 decades to flatten the curve?
It's I don't know. I mean, honestly, like with the way we're going, I just don't know what's going to happen.
That's why I'm a big fan of you do you, because if you're walking out in town in a hazmat suit because you've got legitimate concerns and you're the woman in a bubble, you do you. You know,
I can't realistically, health-wise, walk around in a hazmat suit. I have to do what's reasonable. And the truth is that with how infectious this disease has become, if I'm the only person wearing a mask, I've got to like, you know, and I'm only going to medical appointments, but just the act of taking my elevator to get out of the building to get is a huge freaking risk for me, because there's going to be a bunch of neighbors piling on there, not wearing masks. All they got to do is sneeze or cough and I get particulates in my eyes. Done. You know, and like, because my immune system has become that compromised. And the other part why other people should care about that is that when somebody like me becomes so immunocompromised, if you look at the data, we're the ones most likely to remain sick for a long time, to allow multi-infections and longer time for mutations to emerge from our bodies. And so a crappy like immune system override mutation is more likely to come from us. That then comes back out of me and hits the rest of the population really hard. And so it isn't just about me, but that's another subject. Like, I just want to like back up to like 2021 and what it was like when the vaccine was coming out and they were publishing data. And it was really hard to get a lot of information, which it always is, from drug trials. And I remember finally finding out that they were excluding people with anaphylaxis and serious systemic allergies, which are people with, like me, from their drug trials and their safety trials, their phase 1, their phase 2, blah, 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 right? And, you know, and then you're getting these reports, and I realize they're just small reports, but the first vaccinations and the first phase 3 reports, remember the first rounds of the vaccinations and the phase 3 trials were all medical professionals. Well, here's one thing I can say about medical professionals, people who are still actively working in the medical industry, are two things. One, they're still working, a lot of them full-time, not all, but a lot of them full-time. I can tell you for sure they're not as sick as I am. So none of them represent me. And so some of them are still having really serious reactions, and particularly that story of that woman in Alaska who had such severe anaphylaxis that she had to go into the ICU and be on a epinephrine drip. Most of us do not have immediate access to a chronic epinephrine drip like that to protect ourselves from our throats closing and dying from anaphylaxis. Like, we mostly have EpiPens, but they only last for a short amount of time. So if we can't get an epinephrine drip like that, that would kill us. And so, and then the other thing is that we couldn't in the initial stages schedule to get our shots right by a hospital. We had to go to these community centers and stuff like that. And I'm like, well, it would take me 30, 40 minutes probably to get to the hospital, maybe longer. And by then I'd be out of EpiPens. I'd be out of, you know, I'd be dead if I were to have that. Now that's an extreme worry, but I'm like, they haven't done studies on people with my condition yet. And so like, I'd rather be safe than sorry. And then, you know, because like the most sorry you can be is dead, right? Or brain dead, essentially, or whatever. And I'm just like, I would like more data on this. Now, as things started to explode, and especially as they started reporting Delta increases overseas and initial reports on Delta and how things were spreading, I felt very much between a rock and a hard place. And I did know several people, including my parents, who I thought were like the closest approximation of my condition, because it's sort of genetic. They got it and they were fine. They got it about a month before I did. And so I was like, you know what? Cost benefit ratio, Delta's coming around. If I get it, it's very likely to put me in the hospital, put me in the ICU, kill me, especially like with these blood clots I've gotten, stuff like that. I really think I need to get the vaccine. So I got it. I got very sick from it, like sick about like 5 days, like much sicker than most people got. Not nearly as sick as I got from COVID though. And I got the second one and I got very sick again. And I got Moderna. So when I got my booster, I was luckily able to switch to Pfizer. I didn't get as sick because it's lower dose. It just, doesn't have as harsh of an impact. And I still got sick, but not nearly as sick as with the Moderna. And, and every time I've gotten these vaccines, I've had a short-term setback of this. But the funny thing is like, man, probably about a month after my booster, or not my booster, my second shot, they started a study on people with my condition and other systemic allergy and stuff like that. They started the first study a month after my second shot. And they're like, oh, and you're only eligible if you haven't gotten any shots yet. And I'm just like, really? Like, you're just starting this now for people like well into Delta? It was fucking ridiculous. But people attacked me for being wary of it. And it was so
that's what I disagree
daunting and frustrating.
So I'm disgusted at the polarization of the COVID topic. I'm a little bit torn over the numbers. So some people love to spout about how it's got a 97 to 98% survivability rate, which means it's got a 1% or less fatality rate. Okay, numbers don't lie, it is what it is. However, you need more data. Like, okay, of the 98+% of people who survive, out of that percentage, how many are adversely affected and for what amount of time? Because correct me if I'm wrong, to streamline this and paraphrase, you've been adversely affected and you're not completely recovered from your adverse effects, even though you're in the 98+% of survivors.
Are you talking about from COVID, from the vaccine, from what?
From COVID. So while I do qualify for the 90+%.
I've never fully recovered from COVID, but I've gotten very close to recovering from COVID. But every time I've gotten a vaccine, I've had a minor setback from it. And then we haven't gotten in the year 2022. In January of 2022, I had what is now believed to be probable Omicron again, because that one sort of stealth passes by the vaccine. And also my booster would have been running out. It was more than 6 months, blah, blah, blah. I'm not a high, like my body probably doesn't produce quite the right immune functions. And, my body both overreacts in terms of immune functions, but probably also incorrectly reacts, is what the theory is, right? It produces the wrong things and I'm not going to just be able to, honestly, I could get COVID like 50 more times if I survive.
So my wife caught COVID from work. She's a substitute teacher. She caught it from a kid. Without doing, tremendous amounts of testing to find out genetically where she caught it from, deductive reasoning, she got it from a kid. A kid went out sick, he tested positive, and then like a couple days later, she went down. Now, she was lucky in the sense that financially, it happened the week before Christmas vacation. So she and the kids ended up on Christmas vacation a week early. My wife went down the hardest. Now, she has asthma, and I don't think anything else that would be considered an underlying condition, but she went down the hardest out of all of us. I had essentially a sinus infection for maybe 72 hours, 96 hours, which I just beat the hell out of it with Emergency, vitamin C, Mucinex. My son had, I think, a runny nose for maybe a couple of days. My daughter, completely unaffected. Because of work, I had to go and get tested as well as she did. I went and got tested. And then I can't make this up. Literally, I think 1 week later, 7 days later, I went and got tested and I was negative. Now, I
Mhm.
couldn't tell you how long it was in my system prior to the test, but from this time I got tested and I tested positive to the time I tested negative was literally 7 days apart. By that, I had already had both of my shots when I eventually caught COVID. I don't know what strand that I got. I don't know the strain. Tragically, as somebody who was against the mandate for the shots, I was kind of like a poster boy for the shot because of how unaffected I was, and I didn't isolate
Sure.
myself from my wife. My kids, by just the virtue of how we live, they basically isolated upstairs in their rooms, which is normal for their age bracket anyways. My son was the only one mildly affected. He is still unvaccinated. My daughter was not affected at all. She is still unvaccinated. My wife is still unvaccinated, and she was the only one that was heavily affected. And
Mm.
it kicked her butt. And I don't think she said that she's back to where she was prior to it. But we've basically resumed life as normal. That was pretty much how our 2021 ended going into 2022.
Sure.
2022 has just pretty much been like, oh, surprise. I guess we're not doing this COVID thing. We're doing other stuff. And then we got Ukraine. So I've been tremendously disappointed in the political polarization of it because I think there's a lot more nuance because like just listening to you talk about it, you know, whether you had underlying conditions or not, you've been adversely affected and you could potentially be the producer of adverse effects from what you were saying. I'm just paraphrasing that.
Yeah, no, that's
And that is a separate topic. I guess the only thing I would like to ask, as broad as I can make it, with your own experience, whether you want to think internally, externally, how do you think I don't know how to phrase this because part of me wants to say there's how the entire country should have reacted as a whole, all something billion, something million of us responding and acting from East Coast to West Coast, North to South, for everybody. And then conversely, do you think you should have had a separate reaction for yourself as far as how you interacted with society, how you took care of yourself? I can't think of a better way to phrase it. I hope you get what I'm trying to say.
I mean, so of course there's this whole like hindsight is 2020 thing, right? At the time of my first infection, the information out there was very sparse. And it sounded pretty like, well, I mean, even the administration sort of said, well, we didn't want to scare people, so we really underplayed what was going to happen and that's the information we got from, I mean, really it is a form of propaganda that goes around, and I'm not talking about just from like any political standpoint. The US also presents propaganda, right? Like we do it all the time. And COVID, like I was hoping that an administration change might reduce the level of propaganda, but it has not at all, in my view. It has been just as much propaganda. It's like, okay, the second we have a lull, like let's go to like we keep going flipping from one extreme to the other, from like having this surge to the point where people are dying from very preventable deaths, things that people haven't died from in decades because they're so easy to treat, but doctors are so wrapped up and overwhelmed in their hospitals that they can't get to the patient before their very easily treatable thing becomes deadly. And then it's like, okay, as soon as that's over, which was something that we could have stopped from happening, and as soon as things start to go down a little bit, we're like, okay, it's a free-for-all. let's all get into a mosh pit and spit into each other's eyes. It'll be awesome. No problem. Everything's fine. And then we create another spike where preventable deaths happen again. And it's just wave after wave after wave. It's totally predictable, but like they do it for political reasons, for popularity. They don't want the economy to be negatively affected, so they don't do anything in moderation. It's like these extremes of free for all versus, and if they did things sort of in moderation, where yes, some people got affected and it's kind of unavoidable and blah, 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 and like kept things at this kind of like moderate level and things that were reasonable. Like, for example, you know, if you live in a public building like mine, where there are a lot of disabled and immunocompromised people living as part of the artifact that it's a public building that houses disabled people, like, I think that just like as a courtesy, keeping masking in the elevator so that people aren't fucking spitting their disease, and just in the elevator, right? Just so that we can safely get in and out of our elevators. Just to say, hey, can you just do this as a courtesy so that your neighbors who are really sick can just get to their doctor's appointments? But we don't do anything sensibly. It's like all or nothing. And then a bunch of people get sick, and then we wonder why. Oh, how is this happening to us again?
At the risk of this sounding terribly harsh, knowing, I just want you to know right now that there's nothing personally attached to it. It's just a genuine question, because you're the only person I know of in this circumstance that can answer it honestly. So looking at the macro, you know, I think of that meme, hey, dumbass, use your umbrella so that my umbrella works. Well, you're using an umbrella to prevent the rain from hitting you. If I don't have my umbrella, how does my umbrella prevent the rain from hitting you if you're using your umbrella? The point of that is, at the macro level, do you believe society should conform to the micro? Because I hear what you're saying. You're talking about a basic common courtesy, in which case, because of the number of people that could be affected by any number of things, allergies, you name it, then are you suggesting, and feel free to say what you want, there's no judgment here. Do you feel as though the 2020 COVID regulations should be maintained, single, double mask, face shields, because technically speaking, you never know who you're next to. You never know how they're affected by anything. Anybody and everybody can infect somebody with anything. And I don't mean that to sound derogatory. I'm just, you know, technically speaking, that is 100% probability. Or do you think at the micro level, individuals like yourself need to take personal precautions separate from society? Other than the normal wash your hands when you're done peeing.
Right. There are no personal precautions that I can take to protect myself and get out of my apartment safely if other people are not being conscientious about sanitization, about stopping themselves from spitting, coughing, sneezing in the elevator. Like, it's here's an analogy that I think may help frame it a little bit differently. And I think it's something that a lot of people around the country have grown to accept, but some people think of it as an encroachment on their personal freedoms. But smoking policy in our country has evolved greatly over the past 20 or so years, even 25 years, I would say. In the 90s, even in the most liberal cities, smoking was allowed most places, including restaurants where kids were and stuff like that. And we knew for a long time that firsthand smoke, secondhand smoke, whatever hand smoke was a huge public health problem. Slowly but surely, it was like, okay, we're kind of stopping smoking. You know, they started with sections, and then they started with like, okay, well, sections don't really help because there's still smoke like everywhere. And, you know, we're gonna start not having smoking in restaurants because that affects children. And then pretty soon it became more acceptable to not have smoking in bars. And a really great I think saying that came from a professor that I used to have at one of my departments was, having a no smoking section in a restaurant is like having a no peeing section in a pool. So like,
As somebody who
you can
doesn't
go,
smoke,
you can go and choose to not pee in a section in the pool, but if there's another section where everyone's peeing, gross, right?
well, I think the unfortunate problem is what you're proposing. I see what you're saying. I'm not, I can't necessarily say if I agree or disagree, because you're basically stating that for your purposes and others like you, society has to modify. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing, because I don't live in that world. I don't. I did have a child who from time to time we had to take special considerations because of being a transplant recipient. He was always at risk of anything.
Very at risk. Yeah.
But, you know, it's one of those things.
Probably much more at risk than I am, even because of the immunosuppressants and all that.
Well,
stuff.
He's gone now and he doesn't have to worry about anything. I really don't know how to respond, because I understand your disposition. I could potentially get in your shoes for a minute and pretend to understand, you know, why should you be isolated from society? Why should you be forced into, you know, agoraphobic isolation and quarantine?
Well, and I'm not asking people to be safe. Like, I'm not asking people to be safe when they go out and have fun, when they go see their friends, when they go do anything in their own, you know what I mean? Like, I'm just saying, like, this one tiny part of public space that has like, and it's not just me, but it's like a group of people living in this building. We're disabled. You know, there are many other ways out of the building, but we're disabled. We need the elevator. We need it. We have no choice but to take the elevator. It's a small enclosed space, and it's our only way to get out of our apartments. And it's not even about us being agoraphobic or social, but to survive, we need to go to the doctor.
I hear you.
Which is another protected space. So I'm not even asking about being social. I haven't been social for 3 years, despite my disposition.
Yeah. I'm going to give you my honest opinion. And you don't have to agree with it. I think on the particular topic, if we can give it a solid label, all right, if we're talking about the topic of responding to communicable viruses, diseases, etc., I think right now, if you keep it as simple as left and right, the pendulum, so to speak, has way too much momentum, and it's going to swing violently left, violently right, but eventually over time, maybe not in our lifetime, but eventually over time, it will lose momentum and find center. And I mean that in terms of society. I understand what you're proposing. I don't even technically disagree. I think right now, unfortunately, is the pendulum has way too much momentum swinging left and right, that it'll take quite a bit of time to lose momentum and to find center, you know, to find an adequate, you know, meeting the right in the middle, meeting the left in the middle. And I hope that makes sense to you.
Sure. And although like technically a lot of times like ADA accommodations can be met, like people are not allowed to smoke in our building at all. Like that's the policy, the statutes, the whatever in our, you know, it's not that they're not allowed to smoke. They're just not allowed to smoke on our premises. And that's something that everybody seems to be like, okay, yeah, I signed the lease here. And they can choose to go live somewhere else that doesn't have this policy. They don't have to live in a public housing based building that has this policy or law. They can choose. But a lot of people do want to live in these types of buildings. And, you know, it's like, okay, if you're living in a public sort of communal kind of building, like, do you follow like ADA things where you're protecting the people who are in the building, or is it just a free for all? In my experience, even when they did have mask mandates still in effect, nobody was following them. So I don't really expect for people to care or to do anything to help me, like on the micro level. I don't expect this to change. I expect it to continue to be as disregarded as it currently is. I expect to get COVID until it kills me.
What I agree with is some of the things I've seen as an evolution of dealing with it is it's like things that probably should have been done all along. Like these cleaning services now that offer like this like sanitizing fumigation type thing in like classroom environments where you cannot unavoid contact. That's probably something we should have been doing a long time ago. And if it unfortunately took this and it's the one positive we can take out of it, yeah, just like, you know, back in the day, there used to be people to control the elevator because apparently you didn't have the button. You had to have an elevator man.
Right.
Well,
yeah.
On that note, maybe there should be somebody who can be a productive member of society earning a living whose sole purpose is to constantly sanitize common areas, like an elevator. And I'll be honest, I don't think there's anything wrong with that because you're right. You know, when we had a special needs child, there was this thing that they were beaten down called inclusion. And we can have a different talk about that. Well, why should you be separated like a leper colony? Why can't you be integrated into society? Because anybody and everybody can get sick from the same things: contact, close proximity, you know, breathing. You know, there's only so much you can do that I think is reasonable, but I think it is entirely reasonable to be like, you know, hey, every time the elevator gets to the bottom floor, you know, John or Jane, you know, all right, everybody. I think that's very reasonable, you know, and I don't know if you live in a very specific building, like it's a specific, like if the building itself was designed like, hey, got problems? Come live here. And I apologize if that sounds insensitive, but
no, it's not like that. It's just that there was a policy made because we had a housing crisis, and a policy was made that a certain percentage of all new buildings of a certain size had to have a certain percentage
okay,
of accessible, affordable, blah, blah, blah.
I got you. No, I think this is a fascinating topic because there's probably a handful of others we could talk about, more than a handful. Did you by any chance watch any of my like previous videos on COVID? Because I think I had like one or two.
No, I didn't.
You might have found them a bit more polarizing. I don't know. When I finally agreed to put myself on the internet, I tried to maintain my own opinion, but recognize other people could think and feel differently and not necessarily be bad people. Where I found myself caught up in the us versus them. And, you know, it's literally you choose which side you're on. And I was like, why does it have to be that complex? Why, or even that simple? Why does it have to be an us versus them?
Right.
And just to give you an idea, did you read the Stacy's response on my very last video?
I think so. If it was the follow-up after the one where the losing the point one, is that the?
Yeah, well, one of the things we learned
Feeling like the point got lost.
Yeah. Because I was trying to use a cherry-picked example because of how polarizing and how much attention it's getting. And the two of you were like, I was like,
yeah.
Okay. I was like, I didn't really set any conditions. I didn't really set any parameters. I said what I said. And apparently between the two of you, it triggered something. And, you know, and I was like, well, it's my channel. It's my content. I got to take responsibility how people comment and respond. So when I made that other video talking about taking responsibility, Stacy made a long comment. And if you get to the very, very bottom, some of her final statements can be taken as very polarizing. I'm probably somebody who would identify as not being pro-trans. I'm probably somebody that would be categorized as a Trumper.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
You know, and, you know, I made that pendulum reference because you know, when you talked about the reaction thing, yeah, you got one side of the aisle trying to underreact. You got the other side of the aisle trying to overreact. And there's nobody in the middle trying to react appropriately, you know? And
Well,
that upset me.
I think that, and this is the part where we kind of differ in our thoughts about things is, in regards to the scientific community, and I'm not saying they got everything right. And I'm not talking about public officials who are part of the political scene, but the scientific community itself that's been trying, like people who are pandemic experts, epidemiologists, stuff like that. Like, I think a lot of them have been trying to be really balanced about how they've been moving forward and reacting. But we have a lot of special interests in there, right? Like we have drug companies that are in there, and we have, who are now being called out for misreporting data and all kinds of
We're making
issues.
millions of dollars out of the government's teeth.
Well, all kinds of things. Yeah. Well, and also, one of them partnering with the government, and it was actually CDC scientists who were partly involved in the technology, but then the government isn't able to take that patent for some, well, they are able, but they just aren't doing it. Take that patent, give it out to, we're not able to supply the world, and that is the only way to stop the pandemic, right? Like, if you still have people in countries that are underfunded not getting what they need, and then we have open borders and people are traveling around and stuff like that and going from country to country to country, like, oh gosh, I wonder how this thing keeps mutating and spreading. Wow, I am so fucking surprised by it. But that part aside, is that, the thing about we need more time, this is a part where I disagree with you, is not intellectually about we need more time to study it to know what to do. Yes, of course we do. Often we need years to study something to fully understand it. But we were in a crisis where people were dying at unprecedented rates from a disease. And when you hit something like that, and in first world countries, they were dying at unprecedented rates from a virus, and a lot of people were trying to write it off as like the flu. No, not even close. The rates were so many times more than the flu. And then the ICU issues, the ventilator issues, the preventable death issues, like all those kinds of things. When a crisis comes like that, you don't have years to study something before putting out guidelines. You have to use the best available data that you have, like, for example, in understanding like past coronaviruses and understanding like generally how do viruses respond, what often helps, those kinds of things. You have to start putting out safety guidelines before you have time to study it. And that's why science is often thought of as an evolving thing, because knowledge changes, and as knowledge changes, you update things. And sometimes you have to preemptively, to avoid a catastrophe, like overreact a little bit, or maybe you say something that's wrong, that's an underreaction because it's something unprecedented that you've never seen before. Either way. And so you put out the best information that you have at the time because you have to. Now, if it's something that is just like, well, people aren't really dying from it, but it's infectious, it's a kind of a little bit of a crimp on the system, but
facial reactions. The reason for my facial reactions is, if I'm not mistaken, this is everything I put out in a video a year ago when I attempted to comment on COVID. Since we're already at the 1 hour mark, I'd like to change things up just a little bit and see if we can end on a somewhat fun note.
Okay.
It'll be fun for me. It may not be for you.
All right.
Okay. I'm gonna keep it in the same vein of conversation.
All right.
COVID. Chinese bioweapon conspiracy or complete and total freak accident that could have happened, like stepping on a Lego?
I think that both are possible theories. And
Okay.
I think they're both equally possible because of the way that, like, those wet markets were set up, the fact that there was all these bad, I think that Stephen Colbert had a kind of a funny response about it that, because Jon Stewart like jumped right away to well, it's got to be this lab because it started here and they have a lab that studies it. But like a lot of times people put their labs or places that they study things in the most convenient locations to study them because it's like the most prevalent thing. So they put it near, where there are all these bats that carry these high loading coronaviruses and all that kind of stuff. And so it's like, the truth is we're probably never going to know which one. Now, there are not like, if it was actually like manufactured, I think there would be like these telltale signs that they could find out. But like the accident thing, like, oh yeah, that could absolutely happen. And I think they're equally as plausible. Like COVIDs have been breaking out for years. It's just this is the first one that's kind of survived and spread to this
Right.
degree. That's also been this deadly, like MERS, super deadly, but just wasn't able to spread
So
as fast.
this is my tinfoil hat, if you will.
Sure.
So going back to my very first degree on Homeland Security, where I focused on counterterrorism and the like, I'm not saying it's what I believe, but
Sure.
I'm just playing with this as we close out this video.
Sure.
If there's any country that is potentially smart enough, resourceful enough, and then on top of it, callous enough to not care about the potential impacts on some of its own citizens, let alone the world, and would find a way to profit off of it. And profit doesn't have to be financially as much as it can be other things. People who literally,
Becoming the dominant world power or
yeah,
something like that.
it's China. It's
Yeah.
definitely China. China would more than likely have some of a war game scenario played out by people who that's their job, is to, okay, how do we take advantage of a pandemic? How do we create a pandemic? I'm not saying that's what happened, but wearing a tinfoil hat for a small amount of time, China's one of the only countries right now who's smart enough, resourceful enough, and callous enough to partake in something like that. Even if it started as an accident, but then they found a way to capitalize on it, or whether it was done purposefully, China's the only country who's in a position to make the best of the situation, destabilize governments, etc., so on and so forth. Otherwise, I'm with you on, let me take this off for a minute. Part of governments, having been somebody who worked for a government, some things governments have to do that you may not agree with is sometimes they have to take into consideration how the mass will react. And sometimes what governments have to do is protect information, because individuals can be smart, but when they group together, and you being a psychology major, you're well aware of groupthink, mob mentality.
Oh.
So they have to take that into consideration. So I think, to your credit, you're right. We'll probably never really know, because we may not, as a society, we may not be able to handle the truth.
Well, I also just don't think we're going to have access to China to investigate it fully, et cetera, et cetera. I think it would be very plausible that, let's just say, for example, that it was a leak from the lab. I think it could be very plausible that if it was, and there are people who know that or knew that they're all either inaccessible or dead, right?
Oh yeah.
Like, who would whistle blow or whatever.
Yeah.
And it just said there is nobody to whistle blow on such a thing if it did happen. I'm not accusing anyone or saying that it did, But the other aspect, the reason why I don't think it was a willful, malicious thing is that I do think China is smarter than that. I don't think that they could never do something malevolent, but I do think that they're smarter than that. I think they would have had a lot more prepared and planned. And I think they would have had the vaccine way before us ready to go.
I haven't heard about China's casualties. I haven't heard about China's effect, how it's affected
You
China.
know why though? Because they're suppressing the casualties. There are so many videos you can find on YouTube of people talking about all the people dying, all the people, you know. But they, I mean, they have state media. Anywhere that has state media, how many Russian casualties have you heard about it? How many Indian casualties have you heard? You know, it's just like,
yeah,
there are certain places where they're just not reporting casualties nearly as much as other places.
So I think that's a good place to stop. I think we've been going for about an hour. Sure. FYI for the future, I'm probably going to make a reaction video where I respond to the comments from the previous video. I don't think I'm going to read them out loud because the both of you can get long-winded in type form. And then if you want to geek out over it, if you want to geek out over it, we just finished Angel today. Now we've previously seen it all the way through, but we just watched it again now that we're in our 40s, and we could geek out about that if you want to, and maybe talk about subtext and all that kind of stuff.
I've seen it probably 5-6 times, so.
Oh, perfect.
Maybe
so
10 times. I don't know. I've seen it more than once, we'll just say.
Okay. We can totally geek out about that. And now that we're texting, we can communicate a little bit faster, because yes. I'm with you. Most stuff on the internet, I love a computer. I'm not a big fan of the phone. So I got you 100%.
All right.
Well, thank you so much for participating. I'm going to get this thing published.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Have a good week. Bye.